Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, August 16th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about my All-American team picks. It's definitely a very, very interesting team that I've put together, but I definitely like it. I think it's a solid group. Then we'll give you a little bit of an update of one of the kind of rumors going around college football right now, a possible fall camp portal window coming into play over the next couple of years. Sounds like as of right now it's not being discussed too aggressively, but definitely something to keep your eye out on. Then we'll get into a couple of playoff hypotheticals like we did yesterday. We have five more for you today. Then we'll get into fall camp intel, a ton of injuries to update you on today before we jump into a couple of other things throughout the season. Then we'll get into a weekend roundup with a number of different things that have happened over the last couple of days, over the last week, that I want to make sure I have on y'all's radar. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and we love to hear from y'all. That's what we want here. We want to have an interactive experience between you and me, and the best way for y'all to do that is to use the super chat at the bottom of the chat. You'll see a little $sign. If you click on that, you're more than welcome to leave a question or a comment. It will show up on the screen. We can have a fun back and forth here. If you do not want to use that, you can use gsmcpodcast.net. Still, it is still up and running, and you're more than welcome to do that, but super thanks tends to be a little bit easier. Super chat, tends to be a little bit easier for you all. So definitely use that if you would like to. Really would love to have kind of an interactive experience here. But let's jump right in and let's talk about my All-American picks, because this is a very, very interesting season with, as we talked about, I feel like a couple of days ago, where the talent level across pretty much every position is out of this world. Having to find, the best two wide receivers, I think, this year, the best two running backs, or the best 5 O-linemen even, is very, very tough. So figuring that out was not easy by any means, but at the end of the day, I do think I have a pretty solid group here. It is projection for what I think the end of the year is going to look like. So going in, this would definitely look a little bit different. But I do have Quinn Ewers winning the Heisman, so he is my starting quarterback for the All-American first team. I feel like that doesn't need to be explained by any means. TreVeyon Henderson, I do have as one of my running backs. I think he's going to be downright special, and that two-headed monster at running back for Ohio State will tend to turn into one head throughout the season. Then we'll get into Omarion Hampton, the running back that from North Carolina that is truly just a monster. He's going to go absolutely crazy. Frankly, I think I might have picked him to win the Doak Walker if I was doing it today. But but regardless, he's going to have a remarkable year. And no, I do not have Ollie Gordon on this list. I think he takes a slight step back, and I think overall that offense just looks a little disfigured this upcoming year. Then we'll have our wide receivers, Luther Burden. He's the favorite for the Blitnikoff. He's a dark horse for the Heisman. He's the best offensive player in the country, in my opinion. So no question here. He is absolutely in the running to make this. And frankly, I'd be a little bit surprised if he wasn't at the very least on one of the All-American teams. And frankly, I'd be a little bit surprised if he wasn't on the first, frankly. But then we'll get into Kyron Lacy, a wide receiver that maybe you didn't expect to see on here. But this kid is special. And I think the only reason he wasn't special last year was Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors were on the team. So I think it's opened so many doors for him. Him and Connor Wegman obviously have a very good connection between them, and he's doing really special things in fall camp. I think it rolls right into the season, and he's one of those guys that finds his way probably into the first or second round of the NFL draft at the end of the year. Then Mitchell Evans, he's my pick for the Mackey Award winner this year. I think that offense is going to have to attack the middle of the field. I do like a lot of their wide receivers. I think they've made a number of steps forward, but whenever you're changing that much stuff at a specific skill position, you're going to need a little bit of help around the way, and I think Mitchell Evans is going to have a huge play in this offense, and maybe him and Riley Leonard develop like a Cam Rising, Brant Kuithe type connection throughout this year. So those are my skill position players. I think it's a really solid group. I think you could obviously talk me into Carson Beck or Dylan Gabriel making the quarterback run, or Jaden Ott down at Cal, or Damian Martinez at Miami being the running back. I almost put Xavier Restrepo for Miami at one of the wide receiver positions among a number of other people, Tatori McMillan. I mean, the list goes on and on. It was a very, very hard group to put together because the skill positions this year are just out of this world good. But that's the group that I have. I do think those guys will end up separating just a little bit and will be on that first team All-American. Then the offensive linemen. And this was a little bit easier, frankly. There was one position that was pretty tough that we'll get to, but Will Campbell at one of the offensive tackle positions, he's the best offensive tackle in the country and the anchor of the best O-line in the country, if you were to ask me. So this is likely the easiest pick of this bunch, no doubt about it. He's an absolute beast, and I expect him to be the first O-lineman taken in this upcoming draft. Tate Ratledge, frankly, could be in the NFL right now. He decided to come back. He decided to try to win another national title with the Georgia Bulldogs, and he's going to be a force. He's an absolute problem on the interior, and he's going to move people around pretty much every single week, every single play. He's going to be an absolute monster and be drafted very, very high in the NFL draft. Parker Brailsford, I do have at my center position. There's a reason Alabama went out to get this kid. There's a reason that they were so intent, and yes, it was because of Seth McLaughlin's, shortcomings at that position, but they had people behind him that could have played. Parker Brailsford is just the best center in the country. He's definitely one of those guys that is going to be huge for this offense, and overall that interior looks ridiculous, and that's why I have Tyler Booker right next to him. I do think this was one I was between him and Donovan Jackson, the very talented guard for Ohio State, but I think Tyler Booker is special. I think he's one of the best athletes in the country at offensive line, if I'm being totally honest. And I think he's going to be one of those guys that NFL GMs are just falling over each other to draft once he's officially eligible. Kelvin Banks, the other linchpin of one of the other best offensive lines in the country over at Texas. This guy's been incredible since his freshman year, and he will definitely be a top 10, top 15 pick in the NFL draft by the end of the year. He's an absolute monster, and frankly, if I think Quinn Ewers is going to be special, then I kind of have to think Kelvin Banks is going to be special protecting him. So a huge player for them, and frankly, I think he's going to have a monster season that ends in an All-American bid. Then we'll get into the defensive side of the ball. This one gets a little bit different. Frankly, I believe all of my defenders are from the Big Ten or SEC. I apologize, that's just the way it is, frankly. But my edge rushers, Mykel Williams is someone that I think is going to have a huge year. I'm really buying into this kid. I think he might just lead the country in sacks this upcoming year, and I think he's someone that you saw flashes from freshman year, sophomore year, but now he's fully ready to take the reins and really be the dominating force on this defensive line, and I think he's going to do that and maybe more this upcoming year. Then I have James Pierce Jr. He's one of the most special players in the country, one of the most athletic edge rushers that I have ever seen, and one of those guys that it doesn't matter how good you are as an offensive tackle, he's going to be able to get around you, just plain and simple. He has so many moves in his bag and is an absolute beast at the point of attack. So a very, very good player. Frankly, I think it was between him and Ruben Bain, I was really fighting myself, and Mykel Williams, really, those three players I was really fighting myself for. So Ruben Bain misses this by just a hair, but I do think those are my two picks there. I apologize. And then at linebacker, I have Harold Perkins. He's one of the most special players in the country. This guy can do everything that you want him to do on a football field, and it was just a defensive play caller last year that didn't put him in the right positions. But frankly, I think this staff is going to do an incredible job of that. I think they understand what they have in front of them, and I think they're definitely going to make the most of it. Danny Stutzman is one of the best linebackers in the country, and he is steady as can be for Oklahoma. He's going to have a ton of tackle. He's going to load up on those and just be an absolute dominating force, especially with a defensive line that is still kind of coming along. Seems to be pretty strong as of right now, but overall, I think Danny Stutzman's going to be just an absolute beast in the middle of that defense. CJ Allen is my probably hot take here. I do think this kid is just an absolute monster. He's a sophomore, and he's someone that is going to be an absolute beast throughout his career at UGA, but I do think it starts this year. I think he's in the middle of that defense, and he makes all types of problems for every other offense that he faces. I think he's an absolute monster and someone that is going to be incredible not only this year, but going down the line in his college career. He's going to be out of this world good. At defensive tackle, I do have Jamari Caldwell. I think there's a reason that Oregon went out and got him, and it was such a massive pickup. He's someone that can do incredible things this year. He had 6 sacks a year ago at defensive tackle for Houston. I think he might just be right around that number this upcoming year, but do a little bit better on a little bit better of a defense. So I do think he's one of those players that's going to take a big time step forward, and I think with some of the other defensive tackles around the country being out with injury or different things getting in their way, I do think Jamari Caldwell has a little bit of an opening to make some plays. Mason Graham, I just couldn't leave off here. He's the best defensive tackle in the country, and he's someone that's going to be a problem for every single O-line he faces. I think a good moniker, if he dominates that Texas O-line in week 2, he's on his way to an Outland Trophy. I am being very honest. This dude is going to be an absolute monster, and if he can dominate the interior of that Texas offensive line, it's going to be a long day for anyone that faces him this upcoming year. Caleb Downs is Will Johnson is one of my corners. I have best coverage corner in the country as far as I'm concerned. A really, really good tackler, and frankly, there's a world where he just doesn't get thrown out a ton, and maybe he's left off this list because of that, because he doesn't have the stats. But at the end of the day, it's pretty much a no-fly zone on his side of the ball. Caleb Downs coming over from Alabama to Ohio State. This kid is just different. There's a reason that he was the top tackler for Bama as a freshman, and I think he might just up that number this year. He's an absolute monster, and he's going to do incredible, incredible things on the defensive and maybe offensive side of the ball throughout this year. Malachi Starks, frankly, to me, he's the highest IQ safety in the entire country, and it's a huge reason why I feel really good about this Georgia defense as we head into this year. I think this guy is the perfect person to have back there, especially with some of the worries that you have in the back end. Having that guy back there is an absolute luxury. And then Jabbar Muhammad. I thought it was a huge pickup for Oregon in the portal. He was one of the best corners in the country last year at Washington. I think he ups his game even a little bit more and plays really, really good football this year, and it ends in an All-American team. Finally, my special teams All-Americans, these are a little bit more straightforward, I'll be totally honest. Graham Nicholson, he is wearing a Miami of Ohio jersey there. He is now at Bama, but he's the Lou Groza Award winner from a year ago. He's someone that is just going to be incredible this upcoming year. I think Bama's offense is going to be really good. Maybe they're going to struggle to get in the end zone in those tight window throws that Jalen Milroe needs to make. I think he kicks a ton. And then Bert Auburn's going to give him a run for his money, but I tend to lean Graham Nicholson on this one. Alex Mastromano is an absolute beast of a punter for Florida State and could be a huge asset for them this upcoming year. Came in second for the Ray Guy Award a year ago, and both the finalists that were with him have moved on to the next level. So I'm not overthinking this one. I'm going to take Alex Mastromano. Barry Brown is one of the most electric players in the country. I promise you, if you turn on a Kentucky game, this guy's going to make a play that will make your jaw drop. Just plain and simple, he can fly. Zachariah Branch is one of the most athletic, twitchy kids in the entire country, and one of those guys that he could catch the ball with someone 5 yards from him, make him miss, and go 70 yards for a touchdown. And then Travis Hunter, he had to be on here. He is a first-team All-American level player, but I just didn't have a place for him. But all-purpose makes tons of sense for this kid. He's an absolute beast and one of the best pure football players in the entire country. It was really fun to put this together. I'll be totally honest. It got me very excited about the number of talented players all across the country because it was not easy making any of these picks. There are so many players that are right behind him really fighting for those spots, and I think it's going to be a really, really fun group, and we're going to find out, who rises to the top, but the second and third teams are going to be absolutely stacked as well. So cannot wait for this season. Those are my picks for the All-American team, but let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about kind of an interesting story, a possible fall camp portal window coming into play in the future. Sounds like coaches are not in favor right now, but as we know, a lot of things can change pretty quickly. So we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into my All-American picks for this upcoming year. A very, very tough group to put together because there's talent all across this country at every single position. So there was not an easy choice to make, I can promise you that. But let's get into the second segment here. And this is a very, very interesting idea and one that I hate with all my heart. I'll be totally honest. A fall transfer portal window would be a nightmare, and for a number of reasons. But it's come up in conversation around a number of different coaching circles and college football circles over the last little bit, and just want to give you guys an update on it because it's something that has kind of popped up, especially recently over the last couple of weeks, because this is that time of year, right? We're in the middle of a fall camp. Everything's kind of going about business. You know, you're putting the pads on. You're starting to do scrimmages, all that type of thing. With that comes a ton of injuries, and we've talked about a lot of them on here. C.J. Baxter going down, Charles Jagusa going down for Notre Dame, but at the end of the day, there are tons more, and frankly, we're going to cover a lot more in the fall camp intel portion of this show, but at the end of the day, it changes your entire outlook on your season, especially for Notre Dame. They're now starting a true freshman at left tackle, it looks like, and that totally changes the way that you can look at this season and the way that you feel about that first-round matchup where you can line up Nick Scourton on that side and just say, freshman handle it, and he won't be able to handle it. I'll be plainly honest. Nick Scourton's one of the most special players in the country. So as you look at all these injuries happening around the country, as you look at all of the depth problems that are starting to form around some of the different teams, whether it's Texas or Notre Dame or Oklahoma or Florida, there is a million different injuries and a million different things happening all around the country. And it was something that that is Lincoln Riley, is something that Kirby Smart brought up when he was talking about this, and basically he was kind of bemoaning the future of the sport in some ways, and the future particularly towards the roster cap that is coming into play, the 105 players at max that you can give a scholarship to, that you can have on the active roster. That is obviously something that is going to make life a little bit tougher from a perspective of depth, from a perspective of making sure everyone's fresh, especially in a 15-game, 16-game, even 17-game season. You definitely have a lot on your plate. There's no doubt about that. And it's definitely something that will be really interesting to kind of watch unfold. The reality is there's so many people that, want to figure this out and want to figure out a better way to have that depth going into the season. The only real way is to make sure that as many guys on your roster are ready. And I think that's something that a lot of coaches have said as you've gotten into this. It's something that coaches are really not in favor of at all when you get into the portal window, but also they're not big in favor of all the different, roster constrictions on their program. So it's a little bit confusing. It's definitely one of those things that'll go back and forth a little bit. As of right now, there are so many coaches that are very aggressively against this. And so I don't think we're necessarily seeing anything right away. But let's say, just a hypothetical, it's a very kind of interesting thing to talk about. And down at Texas, C.J. Baxter just went down, was the leading rusher was the leading returning rusher from a year ago. Very talented sophomore, someone that was likely going to be their starter when week one came around. He goes down, and Texas is sitting there, and they're trying to figure out how they want to combat this and how they want to deal with this. In a world where they could, call up someone or they could, DM someone on Instagram. It's a weird system. I'm not arguing that, but there is a world for this because the NFL has this every day. The Falcons just signed a couple of players and they play in a couple of weeks. So it's not necessarily like this is, otherworldly for this to happen, but it definitely would be weird. But there's a world where Texas could call up one of the best running backs at the Group of 5 level or one of the veteran running backs at the Power 5 level and say, we got an opening for you to play. We got an opening for you to find a way onto the field and get some really good reps, and maybe they would take that chance. And also, it would add to a really, really interesting conversation when it comes to things like NIL, where you could pay these guys a lot of money, and the more desperation you have, the more you're willing to pay. And this would be where the desperation would happen, right? So it's definitely a really interesting thing. I think Notre Dame is a prime example of this. There are some really good offensive linemen in the Ivy Leagues, at the Group of 5 level, in the FCS level, that they could have gone out and gotten hypothetically in this transfer portal window after Jagusa went down. but they weren't able to. And that's not necessarily me arguing for that to happen, because frankly I do not at all want this to happen, but I do think it's a very interesting concept, and it's one that kind of opens up a number of different doors and kind of makes it a little bit more like the NFL, as we've kind of seen this develop over the last little bit. And kind of want to talk about a couple of different things that really factor into this and really kind of jump into this equation the most. And the biggest one that always jumps out whenever we have a number of these conversations is, what is the school factor in all of this? Where are we deciding when these kids are going to go to class, and how is transferring in the middle of August going to work for a kid that's trying to get into another university? That's probably the biggest hurdle here, because the reality is there's very, very few people that are going to be able to transfer on, let's say, August 3rd and be able to enroll by August 15th to take their classes. There's just no world where that happens. So that's definitely going to be a big roadblock here, but frankly, they've been able to get over a number of different roadblocks that had to do with school, but that's a total side argument. And then at the end of the day, it is football. It is a game where you go out on the field and there is a world where you get really injured. There is a world where some things go really, really poorly and you have a injury that really hurts you for quite some time. And I think that's the overarching kind of theme of this is, you obviously want these teams to be as well equipped as they possibly can be. You obviously want these teams to be in a position to put the best team out there every single Saturday. And in a world where we could have no injuries, I am signing up 10 times out of 10. That would be incredible, and it would be an incredible thing to watch because the best team would win every year, hypothetically. But at the end of the day, this is football. They are going to hit each other really hard in pretty much every single play, and injuries are going to happen. And frankly, it's one of the things that, I don't love injuries by any means, but the idea of a championship team overcoming a couple of injuries to find their way to glory, like 2014 Ohio State, there's no world where that happens today, because there's no world where they have 3 quarterbacks that are fully ready to go, and on top of that, they don't have a running back like Ezekiel Elliott. But that's a totally side point. I do think it's one of those things where being ready, making sure that you have your 2 and 3 deep guys ready. And yeah, it's about to be a little bit harder with the roster cap that's going to be put into place, but that's the job. It is football. It's going to be dangerous. You're going to have injuries no matter what team you are, no matter how incredible the player is. There's a world where they get injured, and you got to make sure you have a person to replace them. So although you hate injuries and you never want them to happen, they are a part of this game, and they are a part of the game that kind of separates the elite teams from the teams that have a good starting roster. And it's not necessarily to say that the starting roster teams are bad by any means, but being deep is the biggest part of the sport going forward. And I think, adding a portal window in August would be one of those things that it's a get out of jail free card for a lot of these teams that maybe have those injuries. And it's unfair, no doubt about it. Injuries are never fair to the guy that gets injured. But at the end of the day, a team like, let's say, Georgia, being able to go out and grab someone with 1 million, I'm throwing numbers out there. Let's go with Texas, because that was a example we had earlier. They could go out and throw, $1 million at one of the top running backs in the group of 5 level. He's taking that money. There's no two ways about that. He is walking out the door. He is finding his way to Texas, and I think that adds a very, very weird element to this. And I understand a lot of this is free agency. I understand that that's the way things go. But the second that we start creating a calendar that doesn't even kind of fit around the school calendar, then we have a problem. Frankly, we're already pretty far down that line at this point, but at least with the transfer portals that we have in place, they come, in between semesters, after semesters. It gives you an ability to enroll and get into classes at another university. This wouldn't. Just plain and simple, this wouldn't, or at least to the degree that they need to be. So overall, I understand that school is not the biggest part of this conversation, and it hasn't been for a very long time. It should be. That doesn't change the fact that it should be, and it absolutely is something that we need to put more energy into going forward. So I think it's one of those things that, you talk about college football and you talk about how far it's moving forward and how many things are changing throughout this time, but it is still football. There are still injuries, there are still big hits, and it still creates a very interesting conversation for a lot of these teams where do you have the depth to handle a lot of the issues that are coming your way? Do you have 2 and 3 deep, and can you do it with the 105 players that you have at your disposal? So it's definitely going to be an interesting conversation. I think it's one of those things that you'd be hard pressed to get these coaches to agree to this, I would bet. But at the end of the day, if enough big time teams have enough big time injuries, there are things that can happen. And I'll leave it at that for the time being, because I don't like, entertaining this idea because I hate this idea. But at the end of the day, it is one of those things that can happen. It is one of those things that a door can be opened at any moment where, a big-time player, Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, whoever it is, goes down early in the season and you don't have a backup ready to play. There's a world where someone gets in some room and does some things in that negotiation to make sure that this ends up happening. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you got to hold your breath. I'm not necessarily saying this is on the horizon, but as we all know, if something is put out into the universe even a little bit, there's always a world where it happens in the college football realm because money is a good thing. But at the end of the day, let's just keep moving on here. Let's take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a couple of playoff hypotheticals. We're going to get into 5 more today. We had 5 yesterday if you want to go check that out, but definitely a lot of very interesting ones on today. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a possible fall transfer portal window that could come into play in the next couple of years. I wouldn't hold your breath. I wouldn't worry too much about that one as of right now, because there are plenty of coaches that are not fans of it by any means, and I am not at all but definitely an interesting conversation, especially with all of the injuries that are rolling out throughout fall camp. But I wouldn't worry too much. Definitely something that we'll talk about if anything else happens with it. But let's get into some playoff hypotheticals. There are tons of things to talk about this playoff, as there are a million different variables as we head into this thing and a million different questions and how all of this is going to shake out. But let's jump in, and the first question I have is, what if a team with 4 losses finds their way into the field? This is an idea that sounds crazy, and I totally understand that, but there's really only one path that this can happen, right? It's got to be a conference champion that, has out-of-conference losses and then finds their way into their championship and wins it. That's probably the only way that you can really pull this off, and it definitely would be tough to happen even regardless of that, but it is possible. And I think the 2 teams that I really want to zero in on here, oh my goodness, or Florida State and Clemson. Those are the 2 teams that I think it's probably most likely for this to happen to. I think the Big 12, it could have, a 4-loss team in the mix up there, but at the end of the day, I think there will be at least a couple of 10-2 teams that find their way to the championship. But at the end of the day, let's get into Florida State, because Florida State, let's say, loses a conference game. They lose one along the way. It doesn't necessarily matter which one it is, but they lose one along the way. They end up going 8-4 throughout the entire schedule, but they go 7-1 through conference. They lose to Florida in the out of conference. They lose to Memphis. They lose to Notre Dame. That's not necessarily too far-fetched. The Memphis one obviously is a little bit more far-fetched, but let's just say all of those things happen. They're an 8-4 team. They're 7-1 in conference. that likely puts them in the title game, unless there is a big-time logjam up at the top. But if they go 7-1 and say another team like Clemson or Miami goes 8-0 or 7-1, it's very unlikely that anyone else is up in that group. So it's likely that Florida State would be in that dance. You just got to win the title game at that point, and then you're in. You probably won't get that bye because I would have to imagine at that point a group of 5 team would have taken that spot, but who knows? Maybe you could sneak your way in there. Maybe that's possible at the end of the day. The other team is Clemson. I do think they're a very interesting team as we head into this year, but it could happen. You open the week with week 1 against Georgia. People tend to believe they're going to lose that game. I am not making a pick right now, but I would lean that direction as well. South Carolina could be too at the end of the year, a very talented team that by that point is going to look a lot different than what they do in the middle. And then maybe 2 in conference, maybe even 1 in conference and a weird one out of conference like App State. Who knows? But at the end of the day, both of these things could happen, and it would put them in a really weird spot where maybe you're going to Charlotte, but you're going as an 8-4 team. You could turn into a 9-4 team and possibly find your way in, and it would be really weird to watch unfold. But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think this is going to happen, but there's a real world out there where it does. There's a real world where the ACC goes all over the place, and there's a number of different teams that are struggling out of conference, and then a couple of teams just put it all together when conference play comes around, like Florida State and Clemson, and run away with this thing. But everyone else is still sitting back there just kind of watching 2 8 or 9 win teams face off in the ACC title. So I wouldn't necessarily expect this, but there is a world where a 9-5 team makes their way into the CFP this upcoming year. The other thing that might be a little bit of a subplot line more than anything else, and frankly, I don't know if anyone would really care about this by the time it came around, but I do think it would be interesting if the coaching picks for the Bama job faced off in this thing. I do think when you look at the hypothetical of this, it wouldn't necessarily matter to the casual fan that's watching. If you're not a fan of Bama, well, frankly, plainly, if you're just not a fan of Bama more than anyone else, you won't much care about this, but it's definitely really interesting, and particularly for Greg Byrne, the AD over at Alabama. His first 2 picks for the Alabama job were Kalen DeBoer, who has the job now, is doing what seems to be an incredible job, but we'll wait until that thing kicks off to figure out what actually is going on over there. And then Mike Norvell. Those are the 2 that had real shots to win this thing. There were talks about Dan Lanning and Steve Sarkisian and a couple others. They got raises, and that's what happened. And I don't know if there was anything else to that, and I'll leave it at that for the time being. But there's a world where a Mike Norvell 9-seed Florida State walks into Tuscaloosa to play an 8-seed Bama. That would be a very weird thing, but it'd be a must-win for Kalen DeBoer. Obviously, in the playoff, it's always a must-win. I'm not acting like that. Some are must-wins and some aren't, but this would be kind of a weirder one where you got to win it not only because you got to move on to the next round, but because you're looking at the guy that hypothetically would be in your shoes if you weren't. So it's definitely a very interesting conversation. It's one that definitely would be a very fun day on the Bama message boards across the country. It would be really incredible. I'll just leave it at that. There would be a number of very angry or very happy people throwing fun at Florida State or being a bit mad at Florida State as Florida State threw fun at them. So definitely would be a very interesting thing. Also, if you believe that Dan Lanning, Steve Sarkisian, and a couple of the other guys were in it, I tend to not. But if you do believe that, those matchups could absolutely happen as well. And it would be a subplot at best. But at the end of the day, it would be really interesting to watch this unfold and definitely see the reactions from the fans afterwards. See if they are really mad about this hire they made instead of the hire they could have made. But definitely would be an interesting one there. The other one is a little bit more straightforward. What if we see multiple three-peats throughout this season? What if we see teams face off 3 different times, regular season, conference champion, and in the playoff? And obviously the 2 best options here are Oregon, Ohio State, and Georgia and Texas. Those are the 2 that everyone tends to circle, and frankly, I believe in my bracket, I have them both facing off 3 times this upcoming year, and I'm feeling a little bit wary of that, but who knows? I definitely think that's a real possibility. And then you have a couple other teams in the SEC that can make some noise, a couple other teams in the Big Ten, whether it's Michigan against Oregon playing multiple times, Ohio State against Michigan, Penn State against Ohio State. All of those could happen 3 times this upcoming season, and I wouldn't be overly surprised by any means. And then Over in the SEC, obviously, it's going to be Texas and Georgia. Those are the ones that are the cream of the crop, the ones that tend to have the best ability to make that SEC title and the playoff this upcoming year. So they could face off 3 times, no doubt about it. But then Georgia faces Ole Miss, they face Bama, they face Tennessee, they face Missouri. All of those teams could absolutely find their way into the mix, and a number of others across that conference that could hypothetically this happen to. And then you have a couple others. Ole Miss LSU, Bama LSU, Florida State Clemson is another great example of this. So you could have a number of them. And frankly, I would be almost a little bit surprised if we didn't get at least one throughout this season. I don't know if that is a hot take by any means, but I do think it's one of those things that we're going to see much more often. And I've been firm on this that it's a good thing. I understand, you don't want to see Ohio State, Michigan one week and then see them the next week in Indianapolis. But if that's the way it's supposed to be, I have no problem with that. I understand it's maybe not the most ideal thing in the world, but what we shouldn't do is change seeding in some way to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's kind of my big spiel there. That's something that I've kind of felt for quite some time in the playoff era, where it felt like some people were moved around just to make sure they didn't play again, and I didn't like that very much. But moving on, what if 7 of the teams that make the CFP are making their debut? What if it's the first time that they've made it into the dance? In fact, both those teams I have in the picture, I have in my dance this upcoming year. But this is going to be an interesting conversation because on paper it doesn't sound crazy, right? You add 8 teams to the mix. You have so many different teams that have fallen off that have made it, like Cincinnati, Michigan State, TCU, even Washington doesn't look like a real college football playoff contender going into this year. If all of those teams are out of it, it feels like there should be plenty of room, right? It feels like there should be plenty of space for people to file in. But as you look at this, you have the top 5 teams that are going to be in it at some point throughout this year, whether it's Bama, Oregon, Texas, Ohio State, or Georgia. All of those teams are going to have something to say about the playoff. But then you have teams like Clemson, Michigan, Oklahoma, LSU, Notre Dame that have all made it, that are looking to make it this upcoming year. Oklahoma might be the easiest of that group to cross off the list, maybe LSU as well, but at the end of the day, all of those teams have the ability to make this playoff, and that would totally ruin this case. So what do you have to have? Who are the teams that really have to show up and really have to make some noise? First of all, I do think it has to be Miami out of the ACC. I think when you're talking about the ACC, if it's a 3-horse race, as some people tend to believe it, there's only one of those that hasn't been to the playoff. So very much need Miami to be that team that makes that noise in the playoff this upcoming year. I think a team like Virginia Tech could help that out a ton. And then you have a number of others. I think you have a couple others. Kansas State is absolutely a good option here. Iowa State is another team that could make some noise and find their way in. Kansas State I have in my field. So definitely is a number of teams that could make some noise. But who's got to miss? Let's just say, those 4 teams that I talk about, Cincinnati, Michigan State, TCU, and Washington, let's say they're out. That leaves 11 teams because there's 15 teams that have made it in the past. So who of those, 6 of those teams are going to be missing out, and how would they miss out? Let's say Michigan has too much leaving out the door. Let's say Oklahoma's offensive line troubles are very real. LSU's defense doesn't come along the way they want to. Notre Dame drops a couple that they maybe not expect, or they drop the 2 that they really need, and it doesn't end up being that great of a season. Maybe Clemson offense doesn't really improve. Bama struggles, and there you go. You got it. And frankly, that's a lot of hoops to jump through. So maybe this is a little bit tougher than I'm thinking of it right now, but I think when you look at this field, there's so many different variables, there's so many different openings, and I would not be surprised at all if there were 7 teams that were making their debut, whether it's Tennessee or Kansas State or a number of different teams that could absolutely jump into this conversation, and I think it would make for an incredible, incredible playoff. Frankly, I would love it for it to be all 12 new teams, but that's probably downright impossible this upcoming year. And then finally, this is one that I hate to talk about, but I feel like it has to be talked about. Big-time injuries are a huge part of the sport. We talked about it in the last segment, but the big-time thing here is what happens if someone goes down in their conference title game, or they go down in, say, the game right before the end of the season, in that rivalry game, and they don't make the conference title, but they're a shoo-in to make the playoff. that puts you in a really weird spot. And the best example I could come up with is Ole Miss, because I think Jackson Dart is the guy, and I think if he goes down, I like Walker Howard. I'm not super confident that they would be able to reach the heights that they want to with Walker Howard. So overall, I think you look at this team with Jackson Dart, they are 11-1. They could be, SEC champions. They could be the number 1 seed, number 2 seed in the playoff. But let's just say in that SEC game where maybe they're up by 14 in the late in the third quarter, and Jackson Dart gets a knee injury and he's out for multiple weeks, he's out for a month, and Walker Howard's able to do enough, the running game's able to do enough to get them through that game. But then you're faced with a problem because you are a top seed, you get that bye, you get a little bit of time, but he's out for a month. You're not getting him back until probably the semis of this tournament, and you're going to play someone really good in that second round, whether it is an at-large from the SEC or the Big Ten or maybe even the ACC. You're going to have to be ready to roll, and it's definitely someone walking into that building saying, we can beat this team without that guy on the field. So it's one of those things that obviously you hate to talk about, you hate to put out into the universe, but with a 12-team playoff, it definitely is going to factor in. Some teams have been able to overcome some injuries, some teams haven't, and I think there's a world where a quarterback goes down late in the process this year, and things get a little bit sketchy for that upcoming team. Whether you want to talk about LSU or Penn State or obviously Georgia, losing Carson Beck would be huge. So it's one of those things that obviously never want this to happen. Very much hoping that this is not a factor at all in the 12-team playoff history, but I'd be lying if I didn't think it was going to be at least somewhat of a factor as we head into this thing. So definitely a lot of interesting hypotheticals. Frankly, I kind of want to expand on that, so likely we'll get back into it next week because there are so many different things to get into, and it's always fun to break these down. But let's get into our third break here. When we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a fall camp intel breakdown. A lot of injuries to update you on, some that I frankly had forgotten about from about a week ago, and then some that just happened that I really need to update you on. So we'll get to that right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the playoff hypotheticals as we head into this year. There are a number that could really affect the outcome of the champion this upcoming year, and we'll probably continue to get into those. A number of ones that I still want to get to, so be on the lookout for that next week. But let's get into some fall camp intel. There are a million things happening around the sport, but the biggest one happened in Columbus yesterday. Will Howard has officially been named the starting quarterback for the Ohio State Buckeyes. This was one that I think all of us felt like it was going to happen one way or the other. I thought it was going to happen a little bit earlier than it did, and frankly, I think they waited a touch too long already, but he finally is named the starting quarterback for them, and frankly, I think it was a pretty easy decision at the end of the day. And it's not that Devin Brown is not a good player, it's not that he can't come into this offense and make some good plays. He doesn't bring the running ability that Will Howard does. And frankly, that's the end-all be-all. If Chip Kelly has the same exact quarterback in front of him from a passing perspective, which roughly he did between these two, I think Will Howard might have been a touch better, but roughly they are the same level of passer. You're going to take the guy that can extend plays. You're going to take the guy that can run read options, especially with the running backs that you have. And you're going to take a guy that can run through a linebacker's face. It's plain and simple. He is an absolute beast. And he's one of those guys that a lot of people have been talking about. Ohio State didn't upgrade. He was the backup at Kansas State, and now he's the starter at Ohio State. This kid is incredible. He's one of those guys that is going to play as hard as can be every single Saturday. And if y'all watch that Big 12 championship against TCU, you know he has something in there that Ohio State desperately needs, which is just outright toughness and a desire to win at every single second of the game. So I very much like this, not only from a scheme perspective and a player perspective, but from a personality perspective, this guy fits the bill. I can promise you that. The O-line is coming along very nicely, it seems. Seth McLaughlin is leading the way at center, a very talented guy. Donovan Jackson is a known commodity. There's no worries about that, I can promise you. But excuse me, there is a little bit of a battle going on at the other at the other guard position over at right guard. It sounds like excuse me, I apologize. Tegra Shabula is a very, very talented kid that tends to have the inside track there, so definitely something to watch, and no line that really needs to step up their game from a year ago. And then Kojo Antwi just continues to make plays. This is one of my favorite under-the-radar players that going into this year. I think he is one of the most purely athletic guys in that room with just ridiculous athletes all across it. So very excited to see this guy flash this year. And then once a couple of those guys walk off into the NFL, he's going to be a downright beast. I can promise you that. Moving over to Missouri, they had a big-time injury. Darius Smith, a very talented edge rusher that came over from UGA, has gone down with a knee injury, and he will be out for the year. This is a huge loss for Missouri. They needed someone coming off that edge. They needed someone that was going to be able to pressure the passer, and as of right now, as I see it, I think Williams-Nwaneri is very talented. I don't think he's all the way there to be able to compete with some of the tackles that he's going to have to go up against. So it's no disrespect to this team. I think this team is going to be a really fun one, and I think offensively they're going to be as good as there is in the conference. This defense is making me more nervous by the day, and I don't necessarily feel the same way about this team as a lot of people do. I think it's very likely they take a little bit of a step back. That being said, there's still really good players on this team, and a lot of them are taking that captain role on. They introduced their captain this past week, I believe a couple of days ago. Brady Cook doing it for the third time in a row. There was no question that he was going to be one of these. Theo Weiss getting this nod at the wide receiver position, the veteran guy in that room, not a super big surprise there. Christian Williams, a very talented defensive tackle, been there a long time. Johnny Walker Jr. is the other edge rusher that you're going to have to worry about for Missouri. And then Chuck Hicks, a very talented linebacker, are going to be the captains for this year. No big-time surprises, all really good players and definitely guys that deserve that role, and it's always cool. It's never not cool seeing that guy get that honor because a lot of these guys really care about that. A lot of these guys want to represent their university with that C on their chest, and whenever they get that opportunity, it's always a cool thing to see. But moving on to Kentucky, they got a little bit of a running back problem up in Kentucky. Chip Trayanum is reportedly going to miss the first 2 games of the 2024 season. He broke his hand last week. This was a big-time pickup from Ohio State and definitely was one of those guys that could make some noise. That he is a very, very talented player. Didn't really get to show himself at Ohio State for pretty obvious reasons with that running back room, but is a very talented kid nonetheless, and I think will be a huge player for them. It's less than ideal, obviously. You do have guys right behind him. Demi Sumo Karingbe is one of my favorite players in the country. Very solid, does a lot of really good things, and is probably the best run blocker on this team. So, or not run blocker in general, but running back blocking. He's probably the best at that throughout the country. But you got to step up pretty quickly. South Carolina's in week 2. Week 3 is UGA. If this guy is not ready and up and running by week 3, you might have a little bit of an issue. But there is some help from the younger players. Jamarian Wilcox is someone I want to talk about. He burst onto the scene after redshirting last year, a very, very talented kid and someone that I expect to make plenty of plays this upcoming year. Maybe the most outright talented running back in that entire group. A couple other names to watch. Fred Ferrer is a very talented, or Ferre, I'm not exactly sure, a very talented wide receiver for them that is making some noise in a very deep and talented wide receiver room overall. And then Octavius Oxadine is someone I want to talk about. This guy was really good last year, flashed at different moments, was a little bit inconsistent at times, but this guy is really athletic and definitely can make a number of plays and is one of those guys that when you talk about Kentucky, he's not the first one to come out of your mouth, but he might just be at the end of the season. Oklahoma had another injury trouble. Jaden Gibson, a very talented wide receiver for them and someone really one of my favorite outright players in the entire country. He is going to be out for the year. It sounds like he got a knee injury throughout camp, and he will be out for the 2024 season. Absolutely hate this for this kid. This is one of the most electric, explosive players in the entire country, and I think especially with someone like Jackson Arnold throwing the ball, he was going to have a lot of fun in this offense. So hope he gets healthy, gets back on the field as quickly as possible. But let's talk about Jackson Arnold because it sounds like things are not going quite as smoothly as they want. Now, to be totally fair, Brent Venables' defenses are not easy to dissect. So especially as a young quarterback, it's not crazy to see that he is not necessarily winning the battles between the defense right now. But you do have to see a little bit of improvement before you get to that week 1 matchup. I think he'll have a little bit of a runway to get things going, but that Tulane game could get a little bit sketchy if he doesn't come fully prepared in that one. And then a couple other names, Deion Burks we've talked about a number of times, but Javante Barnes is someone I want to talk about. He might just be their feature back this upcoming year. I think Gavin Sawchuk is a really good player. I think Javante Barnes is the more talented guy, and I think he's going to make plenty of plays this upcoming year for them. Moving on to Florida, they had another injury. Imagine that. Jamari Lyons was carted off the field after a scrimmage suffering a broken ankle. He will miss the 2024 season, and that stinks. He was going to be a big-time player for them, appeared in all 12 games a year ago, and while he didn't put up the craziest stats in the world, was definitely going to be a huge player for them. And that defensive front is super, super important for this team. So when you look around, Joey Slackman coming over from Penn is a huge, huge pickup at this point, and definitely someone that you're likely going to put more on his shoulders to make some plays in that interior. But this is a huge loss, no two ways about that, and definitely one that Florida could ill afford at the very least. So something to watch there, and definitely one that could affect Florida's season, especially early on with the incredible offensive line that is coming in for Miami in week 1. Over at A&M, you have a couple of different injury news that aren't quite as bad, which is good news. Anai White, a very talented defensive edge, he's got a little bit of a knee issue. Seems like he'll be back in plenty of time. Jabri Barber, a wide receiver that came over from Troy, he's dealing with a little bit of a foot, but sounds like it's not going to be too big of a problem. He will be back in the starting lineup by the start of the season, and it sounds like, in fact, he described Barber way ahead of schedule. So I expect him to be back, and that's a huge piece for this wide receiver group that seems to be not overly confident in what they have, at least from a depth perspective. So definitely something to watch there. But then you got Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy, a very talented defensive tackle, one of those guys that you came out of high school and really just wanted to see this guy shine. It sounds like he's starting to shine, so very excited to see that. Albert Regis, another guy to watch on that defensive tackle front. Javon Thomas, a freshman corner that's making a ton of plays. Dalton Brooks, a freshman safety that's making a ton of plays. It sounds like Marcel Reed is pulling away in that second quarterback battle against Jalen Henderson, although Jalen Henderson might have a little bit of an edge, at least from history perspective. And then Micah Teese is another person that's coming along a great way, and that's a huge player for them because, as we talked about, the wide receiver depth isn't great. He is someone that could definitely help that out a ton. So a lot of really good news out of A&M. I think there's, some injuries that you got to deal with, but it sounds like everyone's going to be good to go for that opening week, and you can't say the same about Notre Dame. So you got to feel pretty good if you're an A&M fan right about now. But moving on, I want to talk about some quarterback battles around the country. We talked about Cade McNamara and his disastrous scrimmage that he had this past week. They'll have another one this weekend, so maybe he'll get back in a groove. But as of right now, as I see it, Brendan Sullivan's going to be the starter for this team at some point. Maybe it's not week 1. Maybe he doesn't trot out there with the starters right away. But if this is what we're getting from Cade McNamara this year, there is no doubt in my mind that they're going to want to go to Brendan Sullivan at some point. So I expect that to happen for sure. I think over at Michigan, it's Alex Orji's job. Unless something crazy happens over the next little bit, then Alex Orji will be the starting quarterback in week 1 and week 2 and going forward. But at the end of the day, it could be, a Jalen Milroe type situation where he gets taken out after a bad performance against Texas, or it could be a situation where Jack Tuttle gets back from some of the injuries he's been dealing with and just ends up being the better player. Who knows? But as of right now, I feel pretty confident that this is your guy throughout the season for Michigan. North Carolina might have the heatest battle in the entire country, where Max Johnson, Connor Harrell, and Jacoby Criswell are all kind of in this thing. Jacoby Criswell is a little bit on the outside looking in, but it sounds like Max Johnson might have the inside track here, is the veteran of this group, and a very talented guy that can at least move the ball down the field, and that's really all you need if you're a North Carolina fan this upcoming year. But then you have someone like Connor Harrell. He's more physically talented. There's no doubt about that. He is someone that absolutely has a higher ceiling than Max Johnson, and you just got to figure out if he can come along the way that you want him to and make the reps that you want him to as a young player. So I think there's a chance that both those guys play in the season opener, and we'll see what happens from there. It's definitely going to be one of those that I tend to believe will continue into the season and will be very interesting to watch as we get throughout. But Maryland's the last one I want to talk about. Billy Edwards is the favorite right now. He's the veteran. He actually is the outright leader of this team in a lot of ways, so I would be very surprised if it was not him going into week 1. That being said, I do think it's going to be MJ Morris at the end of the year. I do think MJ Morris has the more physical ability, and I think once this season starts going a little bit sideways for Maryland in a couple of different ways, Mike Locksley is going to look at that kid and say, that's our future. Let's put him out there on the field and let him get some big-time reps. So overall, I think there's so many injuries coming out right around this time of year, and you hate to see it every single time, but it's something that we got to unpack. It's something that we got to talk about because it has a real-time impact on this upcoming season. I mean, Texas' year looks a lot different than it did a week ago. I can promise you that. So definitely will be really interesting to unpack the rest of these as they happen, and hopefully there's not too much more and we can get to week 1 unscathed, but we'll update you with everything you need to know as you need to know it. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a weekend roundup, a couple of things that I just want to get on y'all's radar, a couple of headlines and some really cool stories from around college football that I'll get into right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the fall camp intel, a number of quarterback battles out there, a number of injuries happening all around the country, so wanted to make sure you were fully updated with that. I promise you we will continue next week because it's all going to be coming out this weekend with all of the different scrimmages happening around the country. But let's get into the last segment here. Let's get into a little bit of a weekend wrap-up. There are so many things that happened across Twitter and Peacock and a number of different things that I want to get into over the next little bit. But let's jump into this, and I want to start with a little bit of a debate that was happening on Twitter throughout this week. Josh Petty, we talked about earlier in this week, has committed to Georgia Tech, a big-time five-star offensive lineman, and people were confused. There's no two ways about that. I was a little bit confused, but less confused because I, followed the recruitment a little bit. But at the end of the day, it's definitely a very interesting commitment. Usually five-star offensive linemen do not find their way to Georgia Tech. Let's just leave it let's just say it as it is. But it sounds like there was a hefty NIL payment that went along with this. He sounds like he's going to get an annual payment of $800,000 from Georgia Tech, and that's that. He's going to be there for 3-4 years, maybe 1 year, who knows. But at the end of the day, that seems like what the deal is going to be. His father spoke on it and said, my son and other athletes have the opportunity to put together a financial foundation that will allow them to transition in life and able to address the issues of affordability. That's the goal here. And this is one of those things that I see people saying, it's the death of college football. It's the death of amateurism. And yeah, the death of amateurism happened a long time ago, guys. I'm not trying to be, disrespectful in any way, but it's not been an amateur sport in a really long time. The second a media deal was signed for college football, there was going to be a world where this happened because for a very long time, there were kids working 100-hour weeks playing this sport and putting everything they can into this sport, and all they got back was a couple of books and some classes. And it's not that that's not very valuable and very important in this equation, but they deserve more. I never understood this conversation because at the end of the day, if Josh Petty is 3 years down the road and he goes the direction that we expect him to go, because if you're a five-star recruit, they expect you to be a first-round NFL draft pick. That's just the way that they kind of go about business. And if that's the case, if he goes on to be an NFL draft pick, that's fantastic. That's incredible, and that's one of those things that obviously NFL money is more important than NIL money. sometimes kids need the money now, and sometimes this sport can leave you with nothing else at the end of it. There's a world where he walks out onto the field one time and he never walks back on it again. One of the things that I've gotten very frustrated in all of this is, yes, everyone understands that the real life-changing money is at the NFL level. Everyone understands that the NFL level is where you go to get millions of dollars and change your life and change the life of your kids and your grandkids. No one's arguing that. What we're arguing is some kids don't get to the NFL. Some kids get an injury that impedes their ability to get to the NFL, and at least they can make some money to make themselves a little bit better set up for success in the future. So the whole conversation makes me fairly mad, and I'll probably do a full segment on it if I'm being totally honest. But overall, as long as we give these kids the right tools to handle this money effectively, this is not a problem. The thing is not a problem. The process in which we're doing it is a problem. And for me, whenever everyone says, how can you pay an 18-year-old that much money? This is absolutely ridiculous. It's a danger to the sport. It's not. What's a danger to the sport is giving these kids all these money without the ability to make sure they're making the right decisions with it, which obviously is more of a question in college than it is in the NFL. And I'm not arguing that there is a big-time risk giving a kid that's 18 years old $800,000. It doesn't mean he's not deserving of that money. It doesn't mean that he shouldn't have that money, and it doesn't mean that he shouldn't fight for that money. So I understand that NIL has taken over the sport, and I understand that there are some people making decisions purely off the monetary value. That's not what happened here, but we can argue that that's what happened here, I guess. But at the end of the day, it's one of those arguments that I've gotten very, very frustrated in, because people act like the thing is the problem. The giving kids the money is the problem. It's not. The way that we have set up this system where we are 15 years behind is the problem, so these kids don't know how to utilize this money. But I'll move on. I got a number of other things to get to, so I didn't want to be too long-winded here. I'll do a full segment on that, but it's just one of those things that has really frustrated me, as people have kind of just dug their heels in on NIL and have not been able to get out of that mindset. But moving on, Notre Dame has a interesting thing coming up. It sounds like we are going to have a little bit of a documentary around Notre Dame throughout this season. It sounds like it's going to be mostly the off season and kind of building up into this season. So you'll hear from guys like Riley Leonard, maybe Chris Mitchell will be in on the mix. So you'll be able to hear from some of the guys that have transferred in and how they're doing and how they're handling everything. And it's going to be really interesting to watch this unfold, because it could be one of those things that it releases, I believe it releases a couple of days before they play their first game against Texas A&M. Oh yes, August 29th. It's written right here. But definitely will be a very interesting thing to watch. But it's going to be one of those things that I'd love to see a peek behind the curtain of Notre Dame. Frankly, I think it's going to be a lot of how cool is Notre Dame, but at the end of the day, I do think it'll be really cool to hear from a lot of these kids, especially the ones that transferred in, to just get an idea of how that program is moving, get an idea of how, everything is going on and how Marcus Freeman is working out over there in Notre Dame. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch at the very, very least, for sure. But moving on, I want to talk about the good part of NIL here for a second. I don't want to talk down on NIL like it's a bad thing here for a second. Colin Simmons is a really, really incredible freshman for Texas. He's going to play plenty of minutes this upcoming year at edge rusher. Definitely will be a big-time player for him. But he did an incredible thing this past week. He set up a foundation around his brother. It's called, it's called Clay's Color Crew. It's a very, very incredible foundation that's set up to help kids with autism. His little brother does have autism and is a very, very remarkable thing. This is something that if you've seen Colin Simmons throughout his recruitment or throughout his early time at Texas, these guys are attached at the hip. It's a really, really cool thing. These guys are best friends, and it's a very, very awesome thing to watch. So Colin Simmons and his mother, Monica McCarley, are setting up this nonprofit to serve everyone in the South Dallas area. Absolutely huge thing, and something that's really, really incredible. They're selling merchandise and things of that nature if you'd like to get involved in the cause, but this is awesome. This is what NIL was set up to do. This is what, all of this was meant to do, and it shows you just how incredible some of these kids are and how well some of these kids were raised, because this is really, really remarkable and one of those things that, he didn't have to do. He definitely could have just continued on, made his money, moved on to the next level, but this is obviously a guy that, holds this very, very dear and is doing something that hopefully, has a great, great impact on a number of kids throughout that area, and a really just remarkable story that just needs to be shined on a little bit here. Moving on, Charles Grant is another story that a different type of story, but still a remarkable story from him. This was a FCS All-American a year ago, first team All-Colonial, a very, very talented guy out of William and Mary. He was remarkable, and frankly, that led to a lot of calls coming his way around the end of last season, whether it was NFL teams or NFL scouts and agents telling him, you can play in the NFL tomorrow, you absolutely should jump into the NFL, or big-time programs saying, hey, come on over here, play offensive tackle for us, be, part of a national title program. He said no to all of them. He just was like, I love William and Mary. I committed to the school. I want to be here, and I'm going to finish my story here. And frankly, if I'm being told by NFL scouts that I'm getting drafted at the end of the day anyway, I ain't got no problem. So I probably stick out as well. So it's definitely one of those things that you love to hear these stories. And with all the changes and everyone, bemoaning all of the changes with the transfer portal, knowing that there are still people out there that are as loyal as can be. And frankly, I think it's spreading a little bit more over the next couple of years, which is something to watch. But that's one of my theories, that this is going to become a little bit more commonplace than it is right now. So definitely something to watch. But huge shout outs to him. Obviously, hope he has a fantastic season and heads on to the NFL and has a incredible career, because this is one of those guys that is going to knock it out of the park in those interviews, and you're going to want on your team just from a loyalty perspective alone. But moving on, the Group of 5 commissioners are meeting at some point next week to discuss what they're calling a college football NIT. So something we've talked about on here quite a bit is a Group of 5 playoff. This would essentially be that. And frankly, I think it might open a couple of more doors for some FCS teams to make that bump up, but that's a conversation for another day. I think that would be really, really cool to watch. And it sounds like there are a number of people behind this. It sounds like pretty much everyone is around this idea that the CFP is incredible. It's a very fun thing, but at the end of the day, we're not really in it. We get a fun little consolation bid every single year. We'll get the 12 seed, and we'll get railroaded by a team like Texas or Oregon or Alabama. So I don't think they're necessarily too keen on that idea, if I'm being totally honest, even with the payout that they could possibly get. It sounds like the Mountain West Commissioner, Gloria Navarez, is the person that's kind of leading this charge and trying to get this over the finish line. So it'll be interesting to watch. They're going to meet in Dallas sometime next week, and I think this could become reality pretty quickly here. So definitely will be something to watch, and something at this point in the iteration of college football that is broken every which way. I tend to be in favor of this. I think if they can't really compete for a national title, let them compete for their own. So at the end of the day, it'll be a very interesting thing to watch, and a number of different things will be interesting to watch over this weekend with recruiting and scrimmages. There are a million things happening, but we'll update you all on that on Monday. So that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people doing awesome work across every single sport you could want. So if you want a really passionate wrestling podcast, go on over and watch my man Eric. Or you want a lot from the football world, Kenneth has got you covered. If you want sports in general, TJ and Jeremy got you covered. So no worries about that. We have incredible people doing really awesome work across every single sport. So no worries there. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.